Good. You guys can all hear me? Great. So I thought I would kickstart this conversation. We'll see a rolling film of the artist's work. So I'm going to kickstart this conversation by talking about art history itself. And I'm going to ask the artist straight away, in what ways what kind of art histories do you bring to your work? How much do you allow art histories to kind of shape the way that you think about yourself or where you want to position yourself? Amir, would you like to start first?
Sure. I mean, that's a big question for me because so much of my work is about kind of running the entire gamut of art history. So I'm just as interested in Frank Stella's early works and to the point where I've actually incorporated his paintings into my paintings, to Persian miniatures, to skateboard graphics from the 1980s. So my work actually like really embraces different modes of image making from across the entire world because it really speaks to my own personal history of growing up all throughout the world and not really feeling really embedded in one culture, but feeling like I'm part of multiple cultures, or what I like to affectionately call like I think of myself as a cultural mutt, where I'm a little bit of everything. And I think that reflects itself in the work.
Wardha?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. So I have been using the technique of miniature painting, especially with core situated in South Asia myself. I'm from Pakistan, and I've been using the techniques of Indian miniature school in my practice. So there's a lot of cultural references that I'm also taking, like I'm also doing like references from Islamic history. I'm doing research on organic geometry, along with the, whatever the region actually has given me, like images from the Indian Pahari school or the Persian miniature school or the Mughal school. So, I have been using all those gestures that have been presented through history, and we've been looking at those practices, and then, it has become part of my work as well. But my work does not confine into the realm of miniature painting itself. Like I've taken references from the history and then evolved them into other practices and other mediums, like, how to make maybe an interactive work by taking references from history, how to make just an environment which could be just a temperature, or which it could be just about light, or it just could be about experiential art. So yeah, in that regard, you will see images further in the slideshow.
Yeah. Chien-Ying?
I used to have a very traditional ink painting training back in school, but my personal taste is more, tend to the Buddhist art, especially the mural painting. Yeah, and because I think I'm reading history with my body. It's not with knowledge. So I like these more kind of sentimental expression, from the cave painting. Yeah, and also I have this learning about the heavy pigment painting would have to make my painting more expression, rather than traditional ink painting.
I think that's what I like about all three of your work, and how you actually think about or how you use art histories in these very different ways that actually challenge the whole inheritance of art history that we think about, that burden of what is miniature paintings, what is ink paintings, because that comes with ink painting, it always privileges a certain intellectual male scholarly art. With miniature, we really think about small and working on a particular scale, and it also has its own colonial burdens, right, of who we are. And I think both your work, Amir, is so big, it's completely, but it also is very specific as well. And that's the same, I think, with your work. Again, it has a lot of specific references, but yet it speaks to a very global audience. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about the processes and how you think through these ideas. So, and what is it about, what kind of practice, like Chien-Ying, you were talking about cave paintings. What is it about those that particularly draw you into your process of the way that you make art?
Well, that's a very big question. That
all of these are going to be big questions today.
I think at first I'm more interested in, the so-called religious painting. Yeah, because I think religious painting has very special characteristic is that, it just collect all the shitty things of what humanities could be, kind of, the brutality, violence, everything sent, we can call it as a sin, but you put it in religious art, it's like a shining hope, right? Do you agree with that? And I'm just curious about why does it work? Why does it make it like a shining hope about this kind of a PG-18 things?
Right, so you find in religious art this a possibility of exploring something which is hopeful.
Yeah.
And hopeful about what?
Well, that was a very, very hard to explain, but I think what I'm more interested in is not narrative of, this religion concept, but how they to be a religious art.
Right.
Because when you go back to the original Buddhism or original Christianity, there's no iconography.
Right, it's much more about the emotional or the spiritual possibility of what that is.
Yeah, I think what we saw today, as a religious art, it's a creation of artists. How they interpretate, these metaphysical ideas about religion. Yeah.
Do you guys draw in religion or at least narrative? Because miniature is also very much about narratives, right? Amir, look at your work. We were just talking at the back, and I was just saying when I look at your work, it's almost like an epic poem or mixtape is how you end up talking about it. It's almost there is a narrative, but it also upends a narrative in that we can't really read what the narrative is about. And I think yours also has that too. It's not a straightforward narrative. There's almost a suggestion of narrative, but it doesn't quite get to a narrative. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that in your practices.
I think for my work, there's definitely a narrative that I construct, but I'm not so interested in necessarily the viewer picking up on it right away. It's more of a tool for me to create the work, so it's a starting point. And I like to have a little bit of a pushback. I like to have a little bit of a pushback in the work, in that I don't want the work to feel like a one-note kind of message. You get it, and then you can walk away. I'm very interested in having the work have a very slow burn, and it's almost like an onion where you just can keep peeling back the layers, and maybe if you live with it for 6 months, you might notice something in it that you didn't immediately see in the work. So I'm really interested in using this strategy of almost opaqueness to seduce the viewer and keep them longer with the work. So I think what you're talking about comes from that desire of giving enough information to pull the viewer in, but not giving them everything all at once.
Yeah, and that is something very distinctive, I think, also of miniature paintings and ink paintings. There's the idea of close looking, the slow looking, that slow burn. It's not about a very spectacle, in your face. In some ways it's sort of in your face, but really it's the tiny little moments that kind of escapes into your awareness that becomes so powerful, I think, in all your work. I think that would be fair to say. Amir, well, hi.
It's funny because I never think of my works in the tradition of miniatures, although I reference quite a bit of miniature imagery in my work. I think of it more as one of many, many references, and I like it when kind of cultural symbols kind of clash. So in the same painting, I might be referencing Persian miniatures, like I mentioned, like a Frank Stella, and then a French movie poster from the 1930s, and that the confusion and cultural collision that creates is really interesting to me, because it kind of talks about the moment that we're in right now, where most of us on social media, we're scrolling constantly, and we might be following the Met
Right.
And
the
then
bombardment of
yeah.
stuff that we get.
Well,
right?
the bombardment of both high and low culture and both
Right.
old and new.
Yeah.
So, and within 30 seconds, you might be looking at the Met page, then a fashion page, and then maybe a meme account.
Right.
So all the hierarchies are kind of flattened, and they're all in your face simultaneously.
Yeah. Is that
So-
intersectionality? Sorry, Craig.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Yuan's question, because I think fundamentally we're starting potentially with a historic source, say the South Asian miniature, and with that comes questions of format, scale, the visual language, the aesthetic experience that's evoked by that particular historic artistic practice. But you're all contemporary artists, so you're actually all taking that and then you're transferring that historic aesthetic experience into contemporary artistic aesthetic experiences. And Wardha, I know that your practice takes huge leaps in terms of transferring from one to the other. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah. So as you guys have seen the slideshow, and in which you will see the amalgamation and marriages of many materials. So I think I would first like to talk about the narrative aspect. I'm still stuck over there. So I mean, they're not only narratives from the history, but I think how he has just put up, like, you know, we see so many cultures and so many things now. We don't belong to one language or one culture anywhere. So we see these things coming and popping up into our work. And then, you know, things just transform, and it's not only about picking up narrative from history, but also when you put up your work, or when you think it's the process, what would be the narrative of the process? At times I become more interested in the process rather than the final image, and that just defines my work. And then I decide whether I want to, maybe when I put up the work, I want to transform the space, I want to turn the wall into gray, I want to paint on the wall along with the work itself, and how the work is going to transform itself within from the boundary of the frame. And then it just goes and leaps out. But also it's also about, I'm also trying to learn and navigate through this word of translation. I mean, it really matters a lot to me. What does translation mean if I'm taking historical references? So am I translating it? Or if I'm translating it, what contemporary or what new meaning am I giving to the word of translation? And then, you know, then bridges are formed between narratives, translation, history, processes. And then a very interesting dialogue comes up, in which I think takes the artist further into an evolving practice.
Yeah. Do you ever mistranslate?
Of course.
What kind of mistranslations do you? I think mistranslation is so interesting, and I think you also do that in your work in some ways, right? What kind of mistranslation, if you can tell, what kind of mistranslations do you do?
When I do failed projects, and I think failed projects are much, much more important than the actual successful projects, because you learn so much. And at times, you know, mistranslation, well, you're leading me that way, that I think the word miniature is also mistranslated. I don't think that miniature does belong to this time now. I think the word should evolve now, and maybe our practices should be given a new name, because I think miniature word confines our practices in boundaries. And if we don't live in boundaries ourselves, and we don't belong to a single language or a single culture anymore, why should our practices be defined as, you know, why should be it titled as, you know, like, I'm a miniature artist? I actually don't like to be called that, honestly.
Well, because they're almost like straitjackets, right? Because it has that burden of art history with it, and that's the same with ink. It's sort of, you almost represent a certain culture or a certain moment in time, or there's a certain expectations, and in many ways, that's not what you guys are doing. Your process didn't begin in that, right? Do you want to talk a bit more about that? Do you feel yourself as being, because you were saying other ink artists don't think of you as an ink artist. So what do they think of you?
This just talk about the material that I use.
Yes.
You know, if you read or study more about the history, it just found there's so many, it has a diverse perspective to look at that. So I think it's pointless to, identify myself as a specific brand. It just can happen. And And now it's 21st century. You know, if you swipe Instagram, you swipe Pinterest, you know, you can see the tradition from different areas. You know,
So you pick and choose.
yeah, just the position in one platform, you know, with contemporary images.
Yeah.
So I think it's not practical to, you know, to limit myself in only one kind of hashtag. Yeah.
Well, also, I mean, all of you work in different ways that you combine more than one material. I mean, you were talking just a little bit about how you use different process, the failed projects. Can you talk, I mean, I know you also sometimes use 3D models before you start doing 2Ds. And I know you work in paper, but also in clay, and you work in different scales, murals as well. So can you talk about how you use these different, what we consider different landscapes or scopes, mediums, and how you bring them together?
I would like to talk about the boundaries at times that I'm giving as an artist. Like mostly I'm doing shows and my work has to travel to different countries. So at times I'm just confined to maybe produce 2D works, but you know, that's where the challenging part come in. I can easily take reference from a 2D historical work, and then I can, you know, just produce a 2D work and frame it and then send it. But how I challenge myself in that regard, that I maybe involve processes which maybe, you know, by going into a garden and doing real drawings and then converting into a 3D model, and it's one of the things that you will be see as my processes. And then just, you know, playing with that model at times with just light, and I'm just putting it into under a different temperature, you know, and so that process really matters. And then when from that 3D experience of so many, you know, when your sensorium and your 5 senses are involved, then again, when you come back, and I will again use the word translate your understanding of that process into a 2D work, what does that become? I think it opens up many new horizons and many new dialogues and just so much understanding and process to it then.
And you work from 2Ds and 3Ds. So how does that translation work for you?
You know, I think the ink painting tradition has this fundamental characteristic of 2D, right?
Yeah.
And it's, you know, when I want to talk about my ceramic practices.
Please.
Yeah, I use the linear tradition to create a 3D sculpture. Yeah, and
Can you talk about what that means? How do you use a linear tradition to a 3D? Because you're doing the opposite in some ways, right?
Yes, that's an opposite. Because I look at this, you know, the statue in the mural paintings. You know, you see the dripping.
Yeah, the muscular.
Yeah.
Drapery, yes.
I think they are the silhouette of light. You know, it didn't ask for like a very solid quantity. No, it's about line. You know, still light, even this is 3D.
Lovely.
Yeah, so I kind of take this characteristic to my practices.
So you use that line almost as light to sculpture the actual work itself to bring it forward.
Yes, I think it's very related to you know, a brush painting. You know, we double hook to emphasize the silhouette. Yes.
And so you do the same in your sculptural practices.
Yes.
Kind of
So I kind of demand my sculpture, you know, has a very specific light condition to emphasize that characteristic. It's I think it's a vision, a way of saying in the mural painting instead of white boxes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very unique.
It's a very mural.
Yes.
It's a very mural.
Yeah, and it's very fascinating. I think it's a very important hidden tradition in the East.
Yeah. Cave paint is the idea of immersive caves, of Buddhist caves, that idea. But also that sculptural line, that combination of sculpture and painting that you often find. I mean, it's not seen. I mean, there is no word for sculpture in Chinese, right? Really. This is a modern word.
Yeah.
It's a modern word. Even though we had sculptures, there was no such word as sculpture. It was always described by the quality of the line, which is kind of where you're coming from.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And you work in murals. How do you bring wall murals into your practice? Because you do a lot of graffiti. That is a different kind of wall.
I mean, I did like decades ago. That was kind of my introduction to art when I was a teenager. But no, I mean, I work in a lot of mediums. I just made a whole series of aluminum sculptures. I'm working on some bronzes. I've work actively with stained glass. So actually, I'm primarily a painter, but I'd say every year I work with 2 or 3 different materials, and like I mentioned before, like I don't even like the thought of like a direct relationship with miniatures doesn't even cross my mind with my work, any more than the references to design or illustration in my work. I don't think of my work as illustration, although I reference some things that are in the tradition of illustration or in the history of like minimalist painting, like early stelas or. So yeah, I mean, I think of my work as just like functioning in the tradition of like contemporary art, but referencing a very diverse cast of images.
So when you are curated, say they call you a miniature artist, or they put you within that framework of miniature artists, what's your immediate reaction to that? Perhaps.
I mean, honestly, this is the first time it's.
Oh, this is the first time you're in a panel.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think. I'm trying to think like when.
Have you been
press or even like that? It's never framed in that context because I never talk about it in that context. I'm actually not that interested in the history of miniatures or replicating it. I'm more interested in like how it functions as a symbol for something, for a specific culture, specific time.
I like that. I like that idea of that intersectionality that you see for in your work as well. These intersections of different cultures, of different movements that speak to where we are at this moment in time, right?
So one of the things I wanted, and one of the frameworks that I was thinking of when this panel came up, was the fact that we live in a world right now which is, you know, as Chien-Ying was saying, Instagram, you're flipping, you're actually looking at historic practice or current practice from around the world, not just within your local neighborhood. And so we already live in a completely internationalized cultural environment. And yet, you know, we think of this as an idiosyncratic experience of our time. But when I think about the Buddhist cave mural painting practice that Chien-Ying is referencing, and then we start talking about East Asian brush painting, I think it's important to remind ourselves that that Buddhist cave painting practice does not come from China. It actually comes from Central Asia. It involves influences from India, influences from Persia, influences from Afghanistan. And that language enters China, which is why we have the heavy pigmentation, the mineral pigmentation in that painting tradition that we don't have in the origins of the East Asian linear tradition. And so it's already at that time in our language, which is, you know, combining or creating artistic exchange between many different cultures, many different regions. So in a way, if you go back, you know, 2,000 years, it's already a kind of an internationalized visual culture.
For sure. And I'm picking up on that, thinking about, you know, we're all very transnational in the way we move and the way we are becoming. And in some ways, I'm wondering whether, as artists of color, as artists of some sort of Asian identity of some kind, do you find that when you show your work in different places that you need to have that cultural explanation to give people an awareness where your work is coming from? Or do you feel that actually it's okay, you don't need to do any of that? In fact, you don't want to do any of that because you see you don't want to be, again, put in these boxes of certain identities? Yes.
I think I would like to use the word of struggle over here. That since I'm an artist born in Pakistan, living in Pakistan, you know, the West looks at me with the peephole of miniature painting. I've been confined in so many boundaries that she's a female artist, she has this, and this. And then also, like, I'm entitled to the word miniature. So what the West sees me, like, if I'm, like, even in this talk, when I was given this talk, I made sure that I'm going to talk about this as well, that, you know, with miniature, they just think that it's a work on paper and this is, you know, what the artist is entitled to. And I struggle with that entitlement that, you know, my work and my practice does not confines in that regard.
But do you find, if you were to say, show your work in Hong Kong or show your work in America or in Europe, do you find the audiences are different or they have different expectations of you? Or do you think, no, we're actually all actually much more open to this idea of being an artist having these transnational roots?
No, I think we always, when the work travels and especially when the artist travels, you can see so many dialogues happening around your work that you can listen to people. At times I just stand next to my painting and, I listen to people, what are they saying about the work, not telling them that I'm the artist, and then actually, the remarks actually add up to what it is. And they then tell me, oh, this is just a miniature painting, this is what they actually do. Or at times, you listen to such comments like, this is beyond something, this is beyond that reference point of miniature and taking it further. So yes, geography really, really matters. But it just comes to me in a different way, and I'm struggling because I have been living and working and still in Pakistan. So, whenever I'm called outside, I'm always entitled to that bracket that I'm struggling with.
Chien-Ying, do you struggle with the way that you are bracketed by exhibitions or curators or art histories?
I actually did the same things as you did. I just standing in front of my painting and hear what people say.
Oh, you do?
It's fun, and I enjoy how people see different, perspective from my painting. Yeah, and yes, I also like the word struggle. I think it's a common problem for an Asian artist in contemporary world. Because for me, as my practice is, I have very strong historical and traditional burden, if you want to say that. But I don't take it as a burden. I only kind of work it in my own way. Yeah, and I mean that's where kind of conversation happened. When I had this kind of struggling. Yeah. So.
Do you struggle with how you are positioned?
No, actually, I not really. I mean, I show in many different places, from the Middle East to the U.S. to Greece and Europe, for me at least, it's not an issue because there's so much going on in my work and there's so much contradiction. So actually yesterday I heard a couple of people arguing by the booth trying to figure out what my nationality was, and they're like, oh, there's a references to Japanese woodblock painting. Maybe he's Japanese. And they're like, no, I think the artist is Indian. And then another person looked up my name, and and that confusion is kind of like how I culturally feel, and I think that's reflected in the work. And at least for me, it kind of comes out of, I think of my work in a lot of ways as being made in a similar way as to how hip hop is made, where there's heavy sampling. Like Jay-Z will sample an Indian record, or whoever will sample a soul record and change it and add to it and put 2 or 3 different types of kind of these cultural symbols together to make something new.
Do you think how much of that is being based in LA, that you have this sort of a different approach of being an artist, an artist of, I wouldn't even know whether an American artist of Asian descent working in America? Do you think that gives you a very different sort of freedom in some ways? Or not necessarily freedom,
I don't know about
different challenges.
Freedom, but I mean, I think if there was one kind of like school of painting that I would think that my work aligns with, is kind of like the history of contemporary painting in America currently. Like that's kind of what I'm most influenced by and who I've studied with and kind of think about. But there's also other things. So I guess for me, since like I said, I grew up in so many different places, I feel and I live in Los Angeles, which is very multicultural.
Yes.
I always tell my wife that, sometimes I feel more in touch with Mexican culture than I do with my own Iranian culture, because most of my friends are from our Latino, the food that we eat, the holidays that we celebrate, the street names. Mexican culture is such a huge part of culture in Los Angeles that it just becomes a part of you if you live there, like I have for 20 years. So I feel very like culturally non-binary.
Did you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, I think since I've actually incorporated the word struggle, that how I have to deal with the struggle that is entitled by the West, but also I am sort of relying on the same struggle, because actually there is no art scene in Pakistan as such. I don't display in Pakistan that much. There is so many political and religious turmoil going on that I have absolutely no art scene. So I have to rely on these exhibitions that I touch for the thank God that I have in my career, that they offer me internationally. Then I sort of take on to that title as well, and then sort of meander my my dialogue through it. So geography for me really plays a very vital role. I mean, I cannot move because my influences are coming from that society, and I have to stay over there, and I have to be into that turmoil or that aggression, and that's how my work sort of evolves and it takes further, but I'm still relying on that. So it's a very hate and love sort of relationship that I have with that entitlement.
Right. Craig, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring this whole conversation back because I think we've been talking about a lot about context, interpretation, sources, but ultimately, when I look at all three of your practices, they're in a way all deeply personal. And I want to bring this back to the question of how everything that we've been talking about works in service to how your personal experience or your personal identities are reflected in your art. And Amir, one of the things I found fascinating is I look at your painting and I feel like I could write art history through your paintings. But I don't feel like it's art history that's driving your work as much as, like you said, the mixtape of your experience as an American artist. Living and maybe feeling more Mexican than you are, American, or feeling more Mexican than you are anything else. And so that kind of personal experience I find fascinating, and I know that there's a personal dimension that drives the content of the practice. Now, so just going back to that, maybe Chien-Ying, if you have something to share just in terms of what is your art, how does that reflect a personal experience or personal identity?
Yeah, I think my practices is very personal. It matters more than history, and I think most of my practices is about violence in the world. Yeah, and but with a very physical foundation. So.
Can I ask for the audience, how do you bring that violence to the surface of your artwork?
Well, about that, I want to pull back to the Buddhism art history. I think I consider the Buddhist art as a portrayal of a spirituality.
Right.
So I'm more interested in how they represent feelings, and this visualized, sentimental, physical.
But how do you bring that to yourself and your own personal experiences? Because I do find, I agree with Craig, there's so much in all your work. I mean, there's the sort of emotional, they're not landscape, but you know what I mean. They're emotional images. They're full of that. Can you talk a little bit about how you bring your own personal memories and histories into your artwork?
Well, like I said, I think I'm a very sensitive person to people's feelings. And I depict a lot of interesting images, when I, talk to people or having an incident in the real life. I have image in my head. I'm not psychic, but it's a little bit like anesthesia of.
So you absorb other people's emotional things into your own, and you visualize that.
Yeah, and I think these feelings come into me with my physical senses. And I think this connection between the mind and the body is part of my languages. I mean, that's how I, read the world.
I love that. That's so
Yeah.
wonderful. This connection between mind and this sort of organic process, that's really
Yeah,
a big
yeah.
part of your work. And I would say that's definitely true of your work too.
Yes. The history comes in my work in terms of many different phases. Like I'm looking at the color of the old manuscripts and how they're coming and evolving into my work. Then I'm looking at the detail of the artworks that I'm put. So I live in the city of Lahore, which is known as the city of gardens. And I depict my journey as a female Pakistani artist. And being a woman, I use all the narrative of trees, and then I rephrase them into visual knowledge onto my paintings. And those trees actually, transform with historical references and which have been used in 200 years old Pahari school paintings or any other Indian school. So that have been transformed into my work and becomes the botanical language of today. Then there's a lot of, like how you were talking about that that Chinese painting has this character that you look at from a distance, but I use the opposite of it. I use the Pahari or the Indian school colors that were very stark and originated from grinding the pigment and then using gouache into it. So I use very stark colors on the background of my paintings, which actually really helps the viewer to bring it closer to my work, and then when it starts coming closer, then I look at the detail of it. And every time you look at it, there's a new detail to it. And I think that's the objectivity of looking at historical manuscripts as well, that every time you look at it, you reread them in a different way. At times you're just reading the gestures in the paintings, and at times you're just reading the colors or the composition or how he has been using, the line and then transforming into a ceramic word. So my work would taking historical reference, it will be redefined in a contemporary format, but the mask of it is still traditional. The first glance of it would be still defined, and many people use the word beauty to it, how beauty has also been entitled to miniature painting or in painting or all the historical art. I think it has that word of beauty in it. So looking at the first glance of my work, then these things come up, but you really need to come closer and look into the deeper meaning, and then it starts opening up in that gesture.
But also like this idea, you look at these trees, right, that you've lived with, and trees have its own time cycles, and you have your own time, memories have own time cycles, and then history has its own time cycles. So it's again, this intersection of different time zones in this work. And I was wondering if you can talk about why trees? I mean, why look at the cycles of trees? Why not something else? What is it about the trees that spoke to you as a way of thinking about your own sense of self within miniature paintings in Pakistan?
I think it had a lot to do with my childhood, that how I was raised in a family which had core religious background, and how I was raised in a house and we were not allowed to go outside that much. So my mother was a gardener, and the extra time that I used to spend in my mother's garden was literally if I had nothing to do, I would clean the leaves.
You would clean the leaves?
Yes, I would clean the leaves. Yes, because there were a lot of constraints that we have, a lot of boundaries that we have in Pakistan. So, these were my activities. So I naturally developed this relationship with trees and then looking at them in a very different way. Also, when I started doing drawings and scribbling, I was not allowed to do that. I had a very heavy restraint that because of, the historical presence of Islam into that region, I was told that I'm doing something haram, and I was told that I was not supposed to do it. So my mother used to take an afternoon nap. When she used to take an afternoon nap, I used to, steal a white chalk from my school every day, bring it into...
You stole chalk
I
from
stole
school.
chalk from school. And then
Love
when
it.
you used to sleep, my room had white walls, so I used to draw with my arms and my lips. And before my mother used to wake, I used to rub it. That's how I actually drew and started drawing. And also trees, because nobody stopped me with trees. When I used to draw figures, I was literally threatened that I'm doing something that I'm not supposed to do. So then trees came up, and then I just took it that way.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful story. And Amir, one of the things I found in your work is how funny. There's so many funny moments in there. There's a lot of humor in your work as well. Can you talk about your juxtaposition? Can sometimes be the unexpected in a way that kind of Is that something that you look for in?
No, I don't know if I look for humor, but there are, I guess, funny moments. Are you speaking about something in like the large painting?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's probably because some of the imagery comes from like illustrations and comics throughout the last 100 years. But I'm not looking to necessarily have it be comical. But what I am trying to, when I use comic imagery in the work, usually the theme of the piece is very serious or dark, and it's a way to almost
Critique.
well, not just, no. Well, I think about the idea of seducing the viewer quite a bit.
Yes. I would say that's
And so the mark making, the kind of obsessive patterning and ornamentation, those are all used to pull someone in.
But also
and the
your
color
colors.
too.
Your
Yeah, and the
colors
color
are
too.
so
Yeah.
seductive.
So the paintings look very joyous and colorful, but once you start engaging with them, you start realizing that thematically they're talking about very serious topics most of the time. So I think maybe the elements that are kind of comedic could be seen in that way too. It's a way to make, I guess, themes that could very easily be unbearable, bearable, or like to get the viewer to interact with them.
Yeah, for sure.
And also to and also just to create a very complicated image. Like I'm very aware that in the type of work I make, it could really easily go towards the purely decorative because of the use of color and ornamentation decoration. So
yeah.
I really try to throw things in there that steer you off that path. So
Right.
sometimes that's humor, sometimes it's a reference that on the surface doesn't seem like it connects with the original theme. But I'm very interested in complicating the picture plane and not allowing the viewer to write it off so easily as one thing or another.
Because that is always the thing, right? This idea of that seductive appeal to make sure it's not decorative. It's not seen as beautiful in a conventional way, that there's something more that the work is trying to express.
Yeah.
Because that's what you were saying, Wardha, about this idea of beauty that is so easily assigned to works that are generally has a lot of patternization. But in some ways, all of these things are also very disruptive to how we think about art today in many ways, right? Because it brings in ideas. As an art historian, I love looking at contemporary art because it really makes me think about how we must think about art history, how to decolonize it. We must think about the personal. We must think about race. We must think of gender. These things are, and intimacy, right? All of these things are really important to how do we incorporate that into the way that we think about histories today. And I think that's one of those powerful things about looking at contemporary art. Craig, you look like you want to add something.
Yeah, I just want to push back on this idea that, since the 1960s, beauty has become a dirty word in contemporary art, and I just think it's ridiculous. And we've been talking about visual seduction. What is beauty but a form, not the only form of visual seduction, right? So certainly within the wheelhouse of any artist who wants to use it. One of the things I want to point out, if we're going to move to maybe some questions of aesthetics, is color. All three of you have really interesting approaches to color. Amir sort of hinted at it, and I just want to give each of you a chance to just, what does color mean to you? Because color is not representational in your artwork. It's something else. And so do you have any thoughts about color? And if it relates to material, I'm curious. I'm very interested in how you think about material and color as well.
Who wants to start on that one?
I can talk about color. For me, color, like the palette in my works comes very intuitively. I don't think much about the color of the work. I pre-mix all my paints. So I have thousands of jars of paints in like various shades. I work from a digital collage that I create. That's my sketch. And I select the colors on the fly. Like as I'm looking at the sketch, I'll just look at the jars and I'm like, oh, this will be a good green, this will be a good blue, this will, you know, and I just pull them that way, and I start assigning various colors to certain sections. But I think my color sensibility comes from what I was influenced by at a very early age. So the first thing that I interacted with once I moved to America was skateboarding in the late 80s, and that was a huge influence on me. It still is a huge influence on me, and so I think like those early 1980s skateboard graphics with all the bright in-your-face colors. And then later on, I got interested in graffiti art, and again, ornamentation, patterning, embellishment, bright colors. And then I was interested in graphic design. I published a magazine. So again, design, vector graphics, using the computer. So all of these things kind of led towards this one path where, you know, bold, kind of in-your-face colors. But also you could look at it as like, if you look at the history of like Iranian art, from like mosques to the tile work to miniatures, it's all very bold. So I don't know if it's part of my DNA, just a part of my DNA or not, but I'm just naturally attracted to that, and it comes very easy to me, and it's the thing I think about the least when I'm making the work. But I've realized after like 25 years that my palette is very specific, but I don't think about it much, if that makes sense.
For me, the color is very geographical for me, and also defines where I belong to. Like I live in the city of Lahore, which is near the equator, and the temperature is really, really high over there. And because of the climate change and the global warming, the temperature is even rising more over there. So the light of Lahore, I would say, would be very dark or chrome yellow, like in, you know, the hands that you see in this painting are almost all like orange like. So whenever you see something in that light, you know, it changes the references that you're looking at. And then also, you know, my interest of looking into miniature school, or looking at all the Indian schools, like how I have been trained as an apprentice in my earlier years under an artist. The last living ustad of the Mughal school, I have been trained with them. You know, I have learned the practice of miniature painting, making my colors and my paints and my brushes and the paper. It's all traditionally made, but then I've uprooted from it by, you know, have my contemporary understanding of it. But, you know, when I produce work, yes, those references come into the work. But what happens to the work when it travels? And how do you see color when the work is not in the same region where it's produced? Then I use the narrative of color into the space. Then I use the narrative of that historical color into, you know, how I'm using in the background, how I'm using in the foreground, and what would be the color around it, which would define the space of it.
Super interesting. Chien-Ying, how do you use color?
You know what I was practicing, people used to call it like ink, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, that is a question, a very serious question for me, is that, you know, in my tradition, you know, the typical ink tradition mainstream, they don't like colors. You know, it's a kind of, they take color something very cliche and cheesy things, you know, in the tradition.
They think of it as decorative or professional art. They don't take it as serious art.
Yeah. But I think there's something, you know, there's a hidden art history, the hidden potential in this, and it's yet very, very East, very me, very kind of, you know, my culture. But when I'm using colors, there is no helpful, you know, for my ethnic identity. Not at all. It's on the opposite, I think. So I think it also related to this post-war, you know, geopolitical situation, what would happen. So, but I still like colors, and there's so much interesting materials in it.
What do you respond to in those colors? And do you work in similar color? Do you think similarly when you work in ceramics or when you work on paper?
Yes, I think there's a very complicated and fascinating materials things to talk about. I can talk about this all day, but
Okay, maybe about 5 minutes.
okay. I think it's the way I love color is because it's related to me, my body physically. When I use the color, there's mineral pigments, there's foils,
Yes.
and there's a variety of paper. And that combination is, for me, it's kind of a living things, So when I work with the color, the material itself, and I kind of deliberate to stay in the traditional media.
Right. So
Yeah,
you think
still
of the material sort of this organic thing that's part of you itself, right?
Yeah, it's an extension of my body.
Yes.
And it's living things, it's organic. I don't control colors. I work with colors. So they have a different combination when it comes to this environment where I was working, or my kind of mentality when I was working. So I think it's very fascinating. I don't control it.
I love that. This idea that you do not have a predestiny, that the object of art doesn't have its own destiny. It's always evolving, or
Yes.
there's unexpectedness that you love about the work that you try to do.
Yeah, sometimes even if it was intersubjective, that kind of relation, me as a subject and the object.
So it turns it around. You
Yes.
become the subject of your object,
Yeah.
or something along those lines.
That's not here, but yeah, it's kind
No,
of
it
like
totally
that.
makes sense. It kind of goes to your point. You were talking about evolving, right? It's this idea of how you think of your work and your process as an involvement, as a process, rather than as an end goal. Can you talk a bit more about that, perhaps?
I think I would like to use the word that you earlier used, psychological intimacy.
Yes.
Yeah, I just love that thing, that how you develop your relationship with color and onto the paper. Like in my practice, because I have contemporary concerns, but my process at times becomes very traditional as well. There is just not one layer of color that I'm putting of that gouache. There are almost 100 layers of that painstaking rendering technique that I'm still using to make the final imagery in that regard.
I just want to confirm what you said. Did you just say 100 layers?
100 layers, yes.
Yes,
Like,
of
you know,
slowly
Yeah,
painting.
the slow. Like, for example, when my slideshow starts, that you will see an image of a grass painting. So that one stroke of grass is made with a squirrel hair brush, and 120 by 30 paintings at times makes 1 month for me to complete. And I work from 9 to 5 every day in my studio. It's been 4 years. I haven't taken a holiday.
It's so labor. It's really about labor, right? That process of labor is
It's,
such a big part of,
a
or your
very-
body is such a big part. The physicality of it is so there.
I think labor would be a harsh word for me.
Right.
Because then I would not like that into my work. I would actually say that sensitivity and patience. I would actually rephrase labor as
nice.
sensitivity and patience. And, this is how I am as a person as well. Because the slowness of miniature painting, the slowly making of it and a gesture of mark making, how you initially put, that makes you as a person, that makes you as an artist, and also helps me stabilize and to survive where I am,
Yeah, there's
geography
almost a
there.
survival meditativeness about it
Yes.
as well.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. We do have about half an hour left for questions. We can carry on talking, but if there are any burning questions from the floor, we're also happy to entertain them. One of the things we were talking about, and perhaps I can throw this out to you, we were talking about is there another word that we can use other than miniature? Is there another word we were talking about this? Is there another word we can think about instead of talking miniature painting?
And by the way, just in terms of the dialogue that Chien-Ying is part of, we're
Yes.
searching for a term as well. So in Taiwan, we say 招财.
Yes.
In China, we say 种才. In Japan, we say 日本が, urban hua. So there are many, many different names for the materials and the painting method and the process, but everybody has a different way of naming it. So what's a good name?
I mean, that's always one of the questions. Goes back to translations and mistranslations. So if there are any questions, we're happy to take any at this time. Any questions? One. Okay, perhaps we can carry on talking. And if you guys have a question, just, oh, there's one over there. Thank you.
I think currently I'm learning how to join, right? But after, sorry, thank you. In conclusion, art is not for money, but for inspiration and for spirit, right? So currently my daughter is learning how to learn, and her teacher asked her to join the picture exactly as a sample. So I want to know, but I know from your work, it's very creative. So how to give my daughter the kids the guideline how to learn the art?
That's a big question. But it's a good question. What kind of advice you would give for someone starting out in drawing and painting?
I have a 4-year-old son. And since he was like 4 months, he just wanted to paint on my painting.
That's wonderful.
And once he did, right after I completed that painting, I turned around and there he put his handprint, and it gave me a heart attack. But what I learned from his gesture was that I did not confine him to copy something. I just gave him an easel and a space and just asked your child to use the limbs, give him paint, and just ask the child to play around the color. It will learn so much around
Well,
it.
this is like you drawing, stealing when your mum is taking a nap and getting a chalk and starting drawing.
It took her a few years to catch me. But when she caught me, I've already given my art test, so she couldn't do anything.
How did you guys well, let's turn the question around slightly. How did you guys start on your process of becoming an artist? What were some of the triggers points? Have you always wanted, how did you start as an artist? Maybe that's a way of rethinking that question. Where did you start?
I always knew.
You always knew?
I always knew. When somebody used to ask me in grade 3, what do you want to become? I used to take the name of this art school, which I really liked, NCA. And I'm teaching over there as well for the past 10 years. So I always knew, I always used to answer them, I'm going to be an artist. and my parents knew, there it goes. The whole conversation then started. So for me, it was just very confirmed.
Oh, nice. How about you, Chien-Ying?
I think since the time when I can start to pick up something I can draw, when I was a kid, that I won't give up any blank work. I just fill the wall all over.
Oh, you were also someone who liked to draw on the wall.
Yeah, I'm painting it as for parents. But about the question that the audience just asked, I think I'm probably gonna get it. When in the Asian educational system, it's been asking to fit to a paradigm, something that you have to learn from the master. But that's a part of the tradition of ink painting, right?
Yeah, it's always about learning, copying from our past masters. But how do you break out of that? How do you challenge that burden of history that is such a big part of, even as us as children, that we inherit, especially in East Asian histories? How did you break out of it? What was the first step?
I think my experience is that everyone, have your own, you have a body only belongs to you. So even if you're trying to mimic or, to copy, how the other master do, but you still have your own things. That's part of the creativity for this tradition, right? And so I think you should believe yourself with your body. Your body don't lie. Do you agree?
So your daughter's body won't lie. Any advice
just trust
on that
yourself.
side, Amir?
I think just making, like you said, just making supplies available to them and letting them play without telling them what to make. There's no rules in art, so just the act of making, like a friend of mine once told me, paintings lead to more paintings. So, you make something, it doesn't look good, you make another one, maybe it looks slightly better, so on and so forth. Yeah. But also, I also have a young kid, and he's starting to get into art, and I I think just us dragging him to like galleries and museums has really sparked his interest in art. So just taking them to galleries, there's lots of galleries here. Go
Yeah,
to galleries,
looking.
go to museums. Just if you know, they have to be interested, but you know, I think exposing it to them is really powerful. It's probably the best thing you could do. And if they're interested, they'll just dive in head first.
Yeah.
If there's no further question from the audience, I would like to ask something from you and Craig. That when we were talking about giving miniature a different name, have you guys come across the word neo-miniature painting and how it has been defining the contemporary miniatures? I think we three, if we can put under into one title, that would be that. What do you think about that?
So, I mean, how do you feel about neo-miniaturism as a term itself? I mean, that's the term that's often been used now to describe artists such as yourself who works and use materials or skill sets that belong to a miniature tradition, but actually exploring them in different ways. But it doesn't escape from the actual word itself, which is still burdened with its colonial history. It's still something that has and comes from or has been shaped so much by that past that I feel very uncomfortable using it because it also excludes it excludes women for a start in many ways. How about Craig? How do you feel about the word miniature as a category? I feel this way about ink as well, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the exact same way. In a sense that I feel like as soon as we reject a certain name that's forced on us, and then we create a new name, and that new name also becomes a trap. And my dodge for any of these questions is A, look at the individual artists. 2, look at the actual art history, okay? And then don't try and put a name on it. So just go back to what unfolded in history and don't give it a name, but get specific, okay? And then deal with each artist. Don't put a name on it, but get specific with what the artist is actually doing. And so that's kind of my dodge, because I feel like anytime we choose a name or any category necessarily does violence to the diversity of what people are actually doing. So, can we, and at the same time, the art world wants conceptual categories and curatorial frameworks and what have you.
Well, I don't know. I just say keep it simple. Call yourself an artist.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm primarily a painter, but that's about as specific as I personally like to get with my work. Because I reference lots of things. So if somebody called me like an illustrator, that would be wrong too. So I just go with artist. It's simple. People know what you mean.
But in some ways, there is sometimes recognizing that history is also really important in order to disavow it, right? And I think sometimes we need to have that discussion to know why it fails us today, and if we may not necessarily have to answer what it can alternatively be, but at least we need to have that discussion of why it is problematic. I mean, we were talking about ink. In some ways, ink art doesn't allow expressions of queer culture, which is something that you explore in your work, right? That intimacy, that intimate psychology of who you are is so readily present in your work. And the term ink just doesn't seem to allow the category. When we think about ink painting, we don't think about your kind of work, your kind of expression, any more than we think miniature. We think of miniature belonging to a certain type of art. So I think it's interesting, these categories are interesting because we can challenge them. And it brings about a sort of consciousness about the sort of residues of these burdens, which I think is also important to acknowledge.
Okay, I want to push back a little bit here because we've been talking about art history as a burden, as a box, as a label that people put on us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to look at it also as possibly in the artist's hands as a really powerful tool. Okay, as something that enables you to do something which you wouldn't be able to do just going to, typical art academy and learning how to, you see what I mean? It's just like, it's a choice. It's a choice that you make as an artist. So what are you gaining when you make that choice? maybe you can say, oh, I'm shouldering a burden, but I don't feel like either of you or any of you think like you're shouldering a burden. There's something there which attracts you and which allows you to do something powerful. So what is it?
I think the whole challenge of evolving the art history is very positive in the practice. I mean, art history itself can never be a burden because it is knowledge. And how you use that knowledge and how you further your own practice with it, that makes me very happy, personally.
But I'm talking about the legacy of what it is. I do think art history is like art, a process that can be open to creative rethinking and translation all the time, and that's what I like. That's why I love being an art historian, and that's why you love being. I mean, you love it too, right? And
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I think history is more like a Google map. You can just
like Google Map.
It helps you to like identify where are you, but you can find some reviews, on the restaurant. You can go.
Yeah.
That's a choice, but you also can go your own way. You can walk in the alleys, or, walk in the grass fields. I mean, there are so many possibilities, and we were helping to improvise the Google Map, right? That's part of.
Yeah, we're mapping new paths.
Yeah.
That's always creating new knowledge.
Yeah. So I love history, art history, kind of very much, but I don't. I'm not prisoner of art history, right? I'm who I am. So I think it's okay to Google it, or you can use Baidu. I mean, people always say you should use Baidu in Hong Kong, but yeah, I mean, that's what I think about.
It's a carrier bag of many possibilities from which you can bring things to alive.
And I also think that art history gives you identity, which is very important to take yourself further. And I love how you put it into like Google Maps.
Well, an identity that's actually very flexible. It's actually something that's always constantly in flux, and so you can change, right? There is this idea you can wear multiple hats of who you want to be. You're not necessarily predetermined by where you are from.
One of the things I wanted to just mention, some people may say, why is there a panel with Tseng Chien-Ying, who we might say is an East Asian ink artist, and then with Wardha and Amir, and it's just like, is there any actual connection other than they're on the panel? And I would just say, art historically, aside from the fact that the language that Chien-Ying is using is actually not originally a Chinese art language, but enters China from Persia, India, and Central Asia, is that there is an exchange that happens in the 13th century, 12th, 13th, 14th century, in which we call this the Mongol period in Chinese art history, in which there's an enormous amount of exchange, again, going the other direction, or shall we say mutual influence. So there's another period of just complete internationalization of the art form. And that's where, again, there's mineral pigments that are flowing back and forth throughout the region, all the way to Japan and Korea, all the way to Renaissance Europe, and we're all using the same kinds of pigments to create art. So there's also an interesting way in which Amir's personal journey, saying all of these things and all of this art history is deployable by me, is actually also a story of a kind of global art history in terms of global visual language that actually is historically connected. There are exchanges. There's a reason why that woodblock print, that Japanese woodblock print is there, right? Yeah.
I mean, yes, exactly. Like in the same Mughal time period, how you see a dragon in China, and then you see a phoenix in the Persian miniature painting, and then you see these falcons in the Mughal painting. So it all connects visually, and I think it's a lovely connection.
Yeah. Do we have any questions? Again, any questions from the floor? There's a question over there.
Sorry, may I use Chinese?
可以啊，可以啊。
可以啊。就是我看这位艺术家的那个作品的那个手法，有一些是看到有像唐卡，还有那个工笔画的那个方式，但是他又有他自己独特的语言。然后有他自己独特的那个表现手法，然后就有点异曲同工，但是他又自己更创新的那个感觉，就想 请教艺术家是当时是怎么去有这个想法，有这个灵感去做出这样子的造型。
Okay. Do you want to translate that, or should I?
I think
Okay, well,
better than mine.
So it was a question about our audience member was saying, looking at some of the images that the artists, 是哪一个 Tanka 的. So Tanka paintings, some of them look like Tanka paintings, but they certainly have their own sense of originality, and she wants to know a little bit more about some of your ways in which you bring these different things, like and there's some things that are slightly different and very special about what you guys are doing, and so can you talk a little bit more about that? I think in particular she was thinking about your work, Chien-Ying. Do you think there's, yes, the Tanka images?
Well, I could potentially, elaborate on this question. You could add a Tanka painter or a contemporary Tanka painter to this panel, and they would add a really interesting dimension to the conversation. If you're familiar or not at all about what Tanka painting is about, I'm just only mildly familiar, but it's a form of Buddhist religious painting. It would mostly appear on a scroll. It would use many of the same techniques that you see and the same materials that you would see in, say, a Persian miniature or in an imperial Gongbi painting from the Tang or the Song. It's usually associated with esoteric Buddhism, which is the kind of Buddhism that you would see maybe in Tibet, in its Tibetan practice, or in the Himalaya region. And in that, you have a whole pantheon of gods. In addition to the Buddhist imagery, you would have a whole pantheon of different kinds of gods that represent different psychological states in meditation or what have you. And so they're actual visual depictions of those experiences in the form of a deity. And so those Tanka paintings are incredibly visually rich.
And very rich in color and heavy pigments as well, and also a lot of that can also have a very physical bodily presence as well in the depiction. So perhaps, do you want to talk about perhaps some of that, respond to the question?
Well, I think that especially in the religion practices, I think there has been a physical practices. There's something there, but we don't read it on book or on internet. But it was only kind of like martial arts. You have Taoism with martial arts, meditation system, but we don't only see them on the pictures.
Do you look at Tanka paintings in your work, or less so?
I wouldn't define that, but I think it's all related.
Right.
It's a spectrum. I don't
Is that
cut it
more
in
the
pieces.
spectrum of Buddhist art in general?
Yeah, and not just Buddhist art, maybe sometimes even the Christianity.
Yeah, Christian art,
Catholic.
religious art.
Yeah, Byzantine paintings. I mean, there's all connection. I think there's a Eurasia continent kind of a type.
Physical.
Yeah, I don't know how to explain it well because it's so complicated.
Right.
If you, I think her question is how I, transform.
Right, transform that, yes.
I'm more interested in how, the painterly work.
Oh, the painterly pigments and the presence of the paint.
Yeah, and when I look at these old relics, I sense them as a contemporary visuality. You don't see them back then. That's how I look at them now.
Oh, so it's how you look at these art as opposed to how it may once have people.
Yeah, I don't really concerned about what does that mean. I'm more concerned about how do I feel.
Right.
And I didn't really violate what it is because it's
so it's less about the fact that it's a Tanka, but the fact that these may appeal to you visually and emotionally as you're looking at.
And there's a language of body. And I think, when it comes to the sensation, there's no cultural barrier.
That is true. That's kind of the idea of what the body does.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting. All of you have really interesting approaches to the body, actually, in all your work. The bodily presence in it is very different, but it's also very interesting whether it's covered, whether it's using, or it's like you have the mirror effect in a lot of yours, which is also about reflections, which I find, and doubling, which I also find really interesting. And you also have, Chien-Ying, have incredible bodies, that physicality of body as well. Why is the body so interesting for you? in your work?
I've actually never thought about it, so this but this is very interesting to know. Another comment. I think body for me is entitled to energy, to an omnipresence of a female symbol in the work. So I think that's how the body is defined through my work.
So some ways kind of similar to you, this idea of a spiritual, powerful presence of the body. Amir, do you think about the body in your work?
Do I think about it?
Yeah, or the presence of the body?
I mean, most of my work is dealing with portraiture, so yeah.
Dealing with what? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry?
Dealing with
Portraitures. He's got those
Yeah,
He's got those wonderful ones where the women, they're cloaked and covered, and then they're carrying the pleats, that take away the hair.
So yeah, I mean, I think about the body and kind of like the limitations of what the physical body, like what information it gives you. So I'm really interested in trying to take that history of portraiture and kind of turn it on its head, or deconstruct it in some manner, or abstract it in a sense. So the body's just a shell, and everything around the body is more important, because like what we physically look like is very misleading as far as like what that tells you about who we are or what we believe in.
Right. So you use all the frameworks around the body in order to talk about how we think about psychological presence of us.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And I just go back to rephrase this question of the tanka. If you were to think about the tanka as, shall we say, a reflection visually outside of yourself, which you're taking in, but is somehow a reflection of an inner state, okay, a state of the mind or the state of the spirit. But then it's also not like coming from you, right? You are attuning yourself to it, okay? So somehow the tanka is something that you're meditating on, and it brings about a transformation in your own mental state, your own spiritual state. So it's in a way coming from your mind, but then it's also from outside of your mind at the same time. That's kind of the strange thing about how tanka works ritualistically. Not talking about it hanging in the museum when we go and we look how beautiful the painting is, but how it functions in your interaction with it ritualistically. So if you were to think about your work from that perspective as somehow simultaneously something that's coming from inside you and reflective of an internal state, but also just not purely solipsistic, like only coming from you, but somehow touching a reality that is beyond an individual person's subjectivity. Can you relate to that in any way? Because this is what the person in a way is asking, because they're asking about your special individual transformation of the image. Whereas in a tanka, the tanka artist is not trying to express anything to you. They're trying to grab something that is out there and help you attune to it.
I think what is common in all of our practices are that it's not about a single image being created. It's about weaving so many different references and making into your own visual vocabulary. So yes, the element of that reflection, or I may use the word of refraction in the work, is there like a mirror, that you reflect your inner reality onto the surface and present it to the viewer to then think about their visual understanding or their narrative about the things. So it's very interesting to know about the tanka painting, that how it has been done historically, and now in other words we are still doing it, but in a very contemporary way, like just by using the references.
There's that circular relationship between the artwork and the maker itself that continues.
When you talk about tanka, I know there's in Tibetan Buddhism practices is that you meditate yourself to a specific spiritual, like a Buddha or a Bodhisattva. Yeah. It's a practices. And, I think what we do is still, like, some of the book teach you, like, if you want to be Brad Pitt, you got to imagine yourself as a Brad Pitt, and you're getting closer to him. I think it's kind of meditation practices. That practices, you can see this structure in the painting. Yeah, so I think it's, just like when you talk about, it's a reflection of the maker, the painting, and the audience. There's a many kind of multi-dimensional relationship in it.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating.
It
But
is,
you don't
it's-
see much of that in the contemporary, maybe less in the contemporary world, right?
Oh, you think there's less intersectionality of these points?
Sorry, I take that back. It's not appropriate to say that, but I think it was interesting options, to the contemporary audience to see what painting is.
Yeah.
And what's the relation for the painting and physicality.
Yeah, the
The
body and the-
mentality, there's a multi-dimensional.
For sure,
Yeah.
for sure. Do we have any more questions from the floor? We have one here.
谢谢各位老师。就是刚才那位老师就提到了唐卡，就是对心灵的问题。然后我就突然想到了一个问题，就是咱们这个细密画，刚才包括两位老师还提到了这个新细密画这个定义的问题。也就是说，这个细密画它不像国画啊、油画啊，现在有一个定论，它属于哪个种类。但是这个细密画它还是非常非常的有特点的，就是我们看到了这个细密画是非常有形式感、有特点，包括颜色上面。我想问一下三位这个艺术家，就是你们在绘画的时候是先从情感出发的，还是从心灵出发的？因为刚才那个巴基斯坦的女艺术家也说，就是想画一个主题，她先想到能量，还是先从形式感出发？就是先考虑的是形式、颜色，还是先从一个故事，还是先从自己的内心往外走？谢谢。
Okay, so where is the starting point of your making? I'm going to simplify that question a little bit. She was very interested in the question that Craig asked about tankas and its process and its ritual thinking itself. But also she wanted to ask the three artists, where are your starting points in many ways? Is it through storytelling? Is it through colors? Is it through all these, again, sort of, where do you begin?
Can I answer? The starting point of my work is basically a dot, which is translated as nukta in Arabic or Urdu.
I'm sorry, a dot?
A dot. It's like literally putting a dot, like how we use the squirrel hair brushes and, it just cannot do anything. I mean,
And
the
it has
first
a
thing is a
name.
dot.
This first dot has a name.
It's called a nukta.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and and then the dot becomes a line, because a line is then defined by the series of dots, joined together forms a line, and then the drawing comes, and then the color application comes and everything. But also then it gives me a historical reference, and also the spiritual references of, that I have been using in my work, that, the dot is about infinity and where does it takes my work. Then the insulations are at times round as well. And then also when I'm looking at trees, and then you're looking at the organic geometry of trees, so a tree is a semicircle from above and a semicircle from below, it makes a complete dot. And then the dot becomes part of my work. So there's so many layers into that visual that you're looking at. There are historical layers, there are contemporary layers, there are personal layers in it, which makes a painting.
It's all part of that journey as you conceptualize
yes.
your work. Do you have a preconception of what the work is going to be like, or not preconception? What's just so the dot is the starting point as you conceptualize your work in its
Most of the time.
Most of the time.
Yeah.
Okay, Amir, how do you conceptualize your work or start your work?
I mean, most of my work, I make it based around an upcoming exhibition, and then so the exhibition usually has a theme, and like I said, I primarily deal with themes around identity, portraiture, social issues, immigration. So these are all very personal themes that relate to my own life experiences, and then so from there, like for instance, the work at our booth here at Basel is dealing with some of the issues around the protests in Iran. So that becomes an overarching theme, and then I start, sketching the individual pieces together. So I work very thematically, and sometimes the same theme might carry over for a couple of years with exhibitions under that same umbrella in multiple locations.
So you do sketches and drawings as you kind of
Yeah.
figure out and flesh out some of your ideas.
Yeah.
And Chien-Ying, how about yourself?
Yeah, I also do a lot of a sketchbook to record my feelings. And then, because what I did, this jiao cai things is very, it's a sensitive material. So I got to be very kind of carefully prosecuted. It's not kind of I can do it randomly yet. So, but just like what I said, that even if that I have an intention to do a specific work, but the work will kind of or mutually influenced.
Right, because you never know
Yes.
where it's going to take you. But you generally start with contemplating through the ideas itself. So it's
Yeah, I think it's more like a chef. You have so many materials, and you cook, but you have to work with them.
right.
It's a mutual. Yeah.
Right. So so there isn't necessarily a particular starting point with each work that you use. It just really depends on where you are at that moment in time as you're thinking through your ideas.
Yeah, you can say that. Yeah.
Okay. That's wonderful. We may have time for one more questions. If there are no more questions, maybe we can perhaps wrap this up. And I just want to say thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been really instructive for me. I hope it's been instructive for everyone in the audience as well. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your time.
Thank you.